Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you'd like to get an email once a week with upcoming sleep stories and other news, subscribe to the Snoozeletter at snoozecast.com. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Daily Lessons. Tonight, we'll read the next part to the classic children's story Heidi, published in 1881 by Swiss author Johanna Spyri. If you'd like to listen to this continuing story in order, go to snoozecast.com/series. In the previous episode, the good doctor says farewell to his friends on the mountain. The grandfather fixes up a ruined mansion in the village for him and Heidi and their goats to stay for the winter. Heidi attends school. We will pick up at the end of Heidi's visit to the beloved and bedridden grandmother. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Shaking hands with the grandmother, Heidi now said goodnight and, pulling Peter with her, ran outside. The brilliant moon was shining down on the white snow, light as day. The two children were already flying down the Alp, like birds soaring through the cold night air. After Heidi had gone to bed that night, she lay awake a little while, thinking over everything the grandmother had said, especially about the joy the songs had given her. If only poor grandmother could hear those comforting words every day. Heidi knew that it might be a week or two again before she could repeat her visit. The child became sad when she thought how lonely the old woman would be. Was there no way to help? Suddenly, Heidi had an idea, and it thrilled her so that she felt as if she could not wait till morning came to put her plan in execution. But in her excitement, she had forgotten her evening prayer, so, sitting up in bed, she prayed fervently. Then, falling back into the fragrant hay, she soon slept peacefully and soundly till the bright morning came. Chapter 19. Winter Still Continues. Peter arrived punctually at school next day. He had brought his lunch with him in a bag, for all the children that came from far away ate in school, while the others went home. In the evening, Peter, as usual, paid his visit to Heidi. The minute he opened the door, she ran up to him, saying, "Peter, I have something to tell you." "Say it," he replied. "You must learn to read now," said the child. "I've done it already." Yes, Peter, I don't mean in that way," Heidi eagerly proceeded. "You must learn so that you really know how afterwards." "I can't," Peter remarked. "Nobody believes you about that anymore, and I won't either," Heidi said resolutely. "When I was in Frankfurt, Grandmama told me that it wasn't true and that I shouldn't believe you." Peter's astonishment was great. I'll teach you, for I know how, and when you've learnt it, you must read 1 or 2 songs to grandmother every day. I shan't, grumbled the boy. This obstinate refusal made Heidi very angry. With flaming eyes, she planted herself before the boy and said, I'll tell you what will happen if you don't want to learn. Your mother has often said that she'll send you to Frankfurt. Clara showed me the large boys' school there where you'll have to go. You must stay there till you're a man, Peter. You mustn't think that there's only one teacher there, and such a kind one as we have here. No, indeed. There are whole rows of them, and when they're out walking, they have high black hats on their heads. I saw them myself when I was out driving. Cold shivers ran down Peter's back. I'll do it, said Peter gruffly. Oh, I'm glad. Let us start right away, said Heidi joyfully, pulling Peter over to the table. Among the things that Clara had sent, Heidi had found a little book with the ABCs and some rhymes. She had chosen this for the lessons. Peter, having to spell the first rhyme, found great difficulty, so Heidi said, I'll read it to you, and then you'll be able to do it better. Listen. If A, B, C you do not know, before the school board you must go. I won't go, said Peter stubbornly. Where? Before the court. Hurry up and learn the 3 letters, then you won't have to. Peter, beginning again, repeated the 3 letters till Heidi said, Now you know them. Having observed the good result from the first rhyme, she continued on through the rest of the alphabet. Heidi, stopping, looked at Peter, who sat as still as a mouse. Heidi's tender heart was touched, and she said comfortingly, Don't be afraid, Peter. If you come to me every day, you'll soon learn all the letters, and then those things won't happen. But come every day, even when it snows. Promise. Peter did so and departed. Obeying Heidi's instructions, he came daily to her for his lesson. Sometimes the grandfather would sit in the room, smoking his pipe. Often the corners of his mouth would twitch as if he could hardly keep from laughing. He generally invited Peter to stay to supper afterwards, which liberally rewarded the boy for all his great exertions. Thus the days passed by. In all this time, Peter had really made some progress, though the rhymes still gave him difficulty. Often, Peter would growl and object, but nevertheless, he kept on learning and soon had but 3 letters left. The next few days, the following rhymes, with their threats, made Peter more eager than ever, and thus they finished the alphabet. It was 3 weeks since Heidi had paid her last visit to the grandmother, for much snow had fallen since. One evening, Peter, coming home, said triumphantly, I can do it. What is it you can do, Peter? Asked his mother eagerly. Read. What? Is it possible? Did you hear it, grandmother?" exclaimed Brigida. The grandmother also was curious to learn how this had happened. "I must read a song now. Heidi told me to," Peter continued. To the women's amazement, Peter began. After every verse, his mother would exclaim, "Who would have ever thought it?" while the grandmother remained silent. One day later, when it happened that it was Peter's turn to read in school, the teacher said, "Peter, must I pass you by again as usual, or do you want to try?" Peter began and read 3 lines without stopping. In dumb astonishment, the teacher, putting down his book, looked at the boy. "What miracle has happened to you?" he exclaimed. "For a long time I tried to teach you with all my patience, and you were not even able to grasp the letters. But now I've given you up as hopeless, and you've not only learnt how to spell, but even to read? How did this happen, Peter?" "It was Heidi," the boy replied. In great amazement, the teacher looked at the little girl. Then the kind man continued, "I have noticed a great change in you, Peter. You used to stay away from school, sometimes more than a week, and lately you have not even missed a day. Who has brought about this change?" "The uncle." Every evening now, Peter, on his return home, read one song to his grandmother, but never more. To the frequent praises of Brigida, the old woman once replied, "I'm glad he has learnt something, but nevertheless, I'm longing for the spring to come. Then Heidi can visit me, for when she reads, the verses sound so different. I cannot always follow Peter, and the songs don't thrill me the way they do when Heidi says them." And no wonder, for Peter would often leave out long and difficult words. What did 3 or 4 words matter? So it happened sometimes that there were hardly any nouns left in the hymns that Peter read. Chapter 20. News from Distant Friends. May had come. Warm sunshine was bathing the whole Alp in glorious light, and, having melted the last snow, had brought the first spring flowers to the surface. A merry spring wind was blowing, drying up the damp places in the shadow. High above, in the blue heaven, the eagle floated peacefully. Heidi and her grandfather were back on the Alp. The child was so happy to be home again that she jumped about among the beloved objects. Here she discovered a new spring bud, and there she watched the happy little gnats and beetles that were swarming in the sun. The grandfather was busy in his little shop, and a sound of hammering and sawing could be heard. Heidi had to go and see what the grandfather was making. There before the door stood a neat new chair, while the old man was busy making a second. "Oh, I know what they are for," said Heidi happily. "You're making them for Clara and Grandmama. Oh, but we need a third. Or do you think that Miss Rottenmeier won't come, perhaps?" "I really don't know," said Grandfather, "but it is safer to have a chair for her if she should come." Heidi, thoughtfully looking at the backless chairs, remarked, "Grandfather, I don't think she would sit down on those." "Then we must invite her to sit down on the beautiful green lounge of grass," quietly answered the old man. While Heidi was still wondering what the grandfather had meant, Peter arrived, whistling and calling. As usual, Heidi was soon surrounded by the goats, who also seemed happy to be back on the Alp. Peter, angrily pushing the goats aside, marched up to Heidi, thrusting a letter into her hand. "Did you get a letter for me from the pasture?" Heidi said, astonished. "No." "Where did it come from?" "From my bag." The letter had been given to Peter the previous evening. Putting it in his lunch bag, the boy had forgotten it there till he opened the bag for dinner. Heidi immediately recognized Clara's handwriting and, bounding over to her grandfather, exclaimed, "A letter has come from Clara. Wouldn't you like me to read it to you, Grandfather?" Heidi immediately read to her two listeners as follows. "Dear Heidi, we are all packed up and shall travel in 2 or 3 days. Papa is leaving too, but not with us, for he has to go to Paris first. The dear doctor visits us now every day, and as soon as he opens the door he calls, 'Away to the Alp,' for he can hardly wait for us to go. If you only knew how he enjoyed being with you last fall. He came nearly every day this winter to tell us all about you and the grandfather and the mountains and the flowers he saw. He said that it was so quiet in the pure, delicious air, away from towns and streets, that everybody has to get well there. He is much better himself since his visit, and seems younger and happier. Oh, how I look forward to it all. The doctor's advice is that I shall go to Ragaz first for 4 or 6 weeks. Then I can go to live in the village, and from there I shall come to see you every fine day. Grandmama, who is coming with me, is looking forward to the trip too. But just think, Miss Rottenmeier does not want to go. When Grandmama urges her, she always declines politely. I think Sebastian must have given her such a terrible description of the high rocks and fearful abysses that she's afraid. I think he told her that it was not safe for anybody and that only goats could climb such dreadful heights. She used to be so eager to go to Switzerland, but now neither Tinette nor she wants to take the risk. I can hardly wait to see you again. Goodbye, dear Heidi. With much love from Grandmama, I am your true friend, Clara." When Peter heard this, he swung his rod to left and right, furiously driving the goats before him. He bounded down the hill. Heidi visited the grandmother next day, for she had to tell her the good news. Sitting up in her corner, The old woman was spinning as usual. Her face looked sad, for Peter had already announced the near visit of Heidi's friends, and she dreaded the result. After having poured out her full heart, Heidi looked at the old woman. "What is it, grandmother?" said the child. "Are you not glad?" "Oh, yes, Heidi, I am glad, because you are happy. But, grandmother, you seem so anxious. Do you still think Miss Rottenmeier is coming?" "Oh, no, it's nothing. Give me your hand, for I want to be sure that you are still here. I suppose it will be for the best, even if I shall not live to see the day." "Oh, but then I would not care about this coming," said the child. The grandmother had hardly slept all night for thinking of Clara's coming. Would they take Heidi away from her, now that she was well and strong? But for the sake of the child, she resolved to be brave. "Heidi," she said, "please read me the song that begins with 'God will see to it.'" Heidi immediately did as she was told. She knew nearly all the grandmother's favorite hymns by now, and always found them quickly. "That does me good, child," the old woman said. Already the expression of her face seemed happier and less troubled. "Please read it a few times over, child," she entreated. Thus evening came, and when Heidi wandered homewards, one twinkling star after another appeared in the sky. Heidi stood still every few minutes, looking up to the firmament in wonder. When she arrived home, her grandfather also was looking up to the stars, murmuring to himself, "What a wonderful month! One day clearer than the other. The herbs will be fine and strong this year." The blossom month had passed, and June, with the long, long days, had come. Quantities of flowers were blooming everywhere, filling the air with perfume. The month was nearing its end, when one morning Heidi came running out of the hut, where she had already completed her duties. Suddenly, she screamed so loud that the grandfather hurriedly came out to see what happened. "Grandfather, come here. Look." A strange procession was winding up the Alm. First marched two men, carrying an open sedan chair with a young girl in it, wrapped up in many shawls. Then came a stately lady on horseback, who, talking with a young guide beside her, looked eagerly right and left. Then an empty rolling chair, carried by a young fellow, was followed by a porter who had so many covers, shawls, and furs piled up on his basket that they towered high above his head. "They're coming," cried Heidi in her joy, and soon the party had arrived at the top. Great was the happiness of the children at seeing each other again. When Grandmama had descended from her horse, she tenderly greeted Heidi first, and then turned to the uncle, who had approached the group. The two met like two old friends. They had heard so much about each other. After the first words were exchanged, the grandmother exclaimed, "My dear uncle, what a wonderful residence you have! Who would have ever thought of it? Kings could envy you here. Oh, how well my Heidi is looking, just like a little rose," she continued, drawing the child closely to her side and patting her cheeks. "What glory everywhere! Clara, what do you say to it all?" Clara, looking about her rapturously, cried, "Oh, how wonderful! How glorious! I have never dreamt it could be as beautiful as that. Oh, Grandmama, I wish I could stay here." The uncle had busied himself in the meantime with getting Clara's rolling chair for her. Then, going up to the girl, he gently lifted her into her seat. Putting some covers over her knees, he tucked her feet in warmly. It seemed as if the grandfather had done nothing else all his life than nurse sick people. "My dear uncle," said the grandmamma, surprised, "please tell me where you learned that, for I shall send all the nurses I know here immediately." The uncle smiled faintly while he replied, "It comes more from care than study." His face became sad. Before his eyes had risen bygone times. For that was the way he used to care for his poor wounded captain, whom he had found in Sicily after a violent battle. He alone had been allowed to nurse him till his passing, and now he would take just as good care of poor Clara. When Clara had looked a long time at the cloudless sky above and all the rocky crags, she said longingly, "I wish I could walk round the hut to the fir trees. If I only could see all the things you told me so much about." Heidi pushed with all her might, and behold, the chair rolled easily over the dry grass. When they had come into the little grove, Clara could not see her fill of those splendid trees that must have stood there so many, many years. Although the people had changed and vanished, they had remained the same, ever looking down into the valley. When they passed the empty goat shed, Clara said pitifully, "Oh, Grandmama, if I could only wait up here for the goats. I'm afraid I shan't see Peter if we have to go away so soon." "Dear child, enjoy now what you can," said the grandmamma, who had followed. "Oh, what wonderful flowers!" exclaimed Clara again. "Whole bushes of exquisite red blossoms. Oh, if I could only pick some of those bluebells. Heidi, immediately gathering a large bunch, put them in Clara's lap. Clara, this is really nothing in comparison with the many flowers in the pasture. You must come up once and see them. There are so many that the ground seems golden with them.